All right. Hey guys, my name is Shriram, and I'm going to give you guys a brief introductory course on Next.js, specifically trying to use the app router. So the objective of this video is going to be to cover some basic grounds for those who have not had any prior experience working with the Next.js framework, along with a little bit of a basic web development workshop. So let's move on to our table of contents. So in this video, hopefully we're going to try to finish covering the basics of what Next.js app router is, the technology that we use, how to set up and navigate the app router, some basics of Tailwind, and introduction to components, and finally some technologies that I think will make your life a lot easier when it comes to actually making this. Okay, so the Next.js app router. Um, Firstly, what is it? It's just a JavaScript framework. It helps developers build full stack web applications using React. Now, why do I recommend using Next.js? Well, that's because it's currently one of the industry standards when it comes to web development, and it provides a massive selection of tools and libraries to help create beautiful and cohesive websites. Next.js also paves the way for SSR and SSG. SSR is server-side rendering. This is where pages are rendered on the server for each request. So think about when a user visits a page, the server generates the HTML dynamically according to a user and sends it back to a browser. So this is extremely useful when content needs to be updated frequently or customized for each user, like think about dashboards, real-time data, or user-specific content. Um, In short, SSR allows users to see content quicker as the page is rendered with the data from the server before it even reaches the browser. And then let's move on to what SSG is, which is static site generation. In SSG, the pages are pre-rendered and at something called build time. And this just means that the HTML is generated once, and that same static file are served to every user. Now, this method is great for pages that don't actually need to be changed frequently, and think about stuff like blogs or documentation or marketing websites. Now, SSG offers extremely fast performance since the server doesn't have to do any work when serving requests, and the files are already built and ready to go. So now let's move on to technologies. So in this, we're going to be covering three technologies: React, TypeScript, Tailwind, CSS. And when I say React, we're just referring to the Facebook's open source library of front-end JavaScript tools. And these tools are just needed to easily communicate with the server and will serve importance when discussing component logic. And yeah, now moving on to TypeScript, it's the language choice when it comes to creating Next.js apps. And it's the basis for front-end development and is chosen because of its ability to do something called statically typed. And TypeScript allows for your variables to be pre-declared and checked. And by doing this, you're saving on runtime because you can see your errors pre-render. And it's just great for being able to code in advance without having to like worry about is something being wrong when you're actually trying to render a website. And the final technology we're going to be using is Tailwind CSS, and it's just the framework of choice for when it comes to styling your website. If you're familiar with HTML and CSS, you know that CSS files are often written in tandem to an HTML file just to include styling the page. Um, and it often includes specific classes created for specific parts of the HTML. Instead, all of this can be done within the single TSX file, which is what Tailwind is. And you can just write all of your whatever your like declarations are for view um, within a class names of each component or part of your TypeScript. Now let's move on to setting up Next.js. When it comes to first creating and deploying your system, you have to start with these commands. Given that this is a beginner's course, when creating your Next application, we're going to stick to the default choice presented by Next. And once you finalize in creating your folder, we're going to move into it with a change directory and then deploy it with npm run dev. Now let's load up an example to show you guys how this looks. Um, let's first open up VS Code right here, and let's open up a empty folder. So I'm going to go here into my desktop React introduction and open it up. As you guys can see, there's absolutely nothing in this. And now we're going to open up our terminal. All right, so when you're in this terminal, what you want to do is first enter npx create dash next dash app at latest and click. Now we're going to have to ask to install a few packages. This may vary for everyone depending on what's updated and what's not. But let's okay, proceed. And now what is our project named? So typically when we're talking about Next.js, everything has to be lowercase because that's just what their case sensitivity is. So we're just going to say test. And would you like to use TypeScript now? Like I said, we will be using TypeScript, so it's going to be yes. ESLint again. I'm going to remind you, we're going to stick to our default values. Yes, Tailwind. Now this is the important one. We want to pay particular attention, make sure that we include Tailwind in our creation. So yes, no, and then app router, because that's what we're going to be using. Yes. And cool. So once this finishes loading up, you guys can move on to the next bit, which is changing directory. Okay, perfect. So once we have created our thing, we're going to change directories into it. Let's do cd and then test to move into it. And now that we're in it, let's run it. npm run dev. So as you can see, we're going to open up in a local host. This is pretty basic things. So we're going to open up here, create a new tab, just say localhost 1301. 30. And now this is what our website's going to look like. Now let's try to move on to what this app router actually does. And for that, let's open up this. And as you can see, there's a bunch of files. But the one we want to pay particular attention to is this folder right here. It's called app. There's a list of things here that we will cover right here in our next slide. Okay, so when we're looking at this is just a basic breakdown of all the important things I think you should look at when it comes to the app router. And the biggest thing is just the app folder, which is just your app router folder. As you can see, there are two important files called layout.tsx and page.tsx. Now, these are your default page. These are what's actually formatting what you guys see when you're running this website the first time. Page.tsx holds the content of what the page actually shows, and this layout.tsx defines the layout. So which is pretty self-explanatory, but what you can imagine is when you're running through multiple different pages that all should format the same for either different views like mobile and web, or um, have to include something consistent throughout all the pages like a navigation bar, we can usually include that into a layout.tsx instead. Just helps clean up navigation when you're going through a code base. And now we're going to ignore this about and page.tsx as that's for an example later on. And now let's go public. Public is just what you guys have in terms of assets that you don't mind anyone seeing, because those anyways are public images you use in your website. So these are usually just images, fonts, things like that. Same thing with styles. And these usually contain what your global CSS styles are, but because we're using Tailwind, this isn't something we should be like too worried about. And the next thing is next.config.js, and that's just really important if you're ever going to use any like tools or like frameworks that help improve or optimize your code base. And I will explain that later when we're going to our sixth part. And now this is components. Components will again be covered in a little bit, but for right now, you just understand where it should usually be placed in your code base. And the last one is package.json, again, for project dependencies and scripts and stuff like that. Okay, so now that we've actually covered what is present in the app router, let's actually talk about navigating through it. So I think the biggest thing that needs to be understood is actually just this little blurb right here that talks about page.tsx, how it's automatically set to, oops, a mistake there, how it's automatically set to backslash. And you guys might be wondering why, what's up with that? That's just referring to this. Now, this is what you automatically see. Now, this is your home page. This is what loads up every single time you just search the URL, and that's what it's referring to. And as you can see, the whole idea of the app router is it treats folders as like a hierarchy towards how your web page is structured in terms of links. And I think the best way to explain this is honestly just by an example. So let's open up VS Code again. And let's just look at how our app router works. Right now we have this, and now let's just say I want a folder within this called about. Right, so let's first create that about page. And now remember, to render anything, Next.js needs to know, Next.js needs a page.tsx within a folder to know that this is something that they want to render. So let's first create that page.tsx. And as you can see, we have this page. And technically right now it still won't render because we are missing a few things just required. So let's fix that real quick with this, and let's just call this about me. And that's just referring to this stuff. And let's just create a little blurb saying, hi, I'm now, if we went back to our uh, build, we can see that there's no direct link, but if I was to switch my URL to include /about, wow, we can see it says hi Shriram. So, and this is kind of the understanding of like the navigation aspect of it, and I'll kind of give you a bit more in-depth explanation of how to make links to switch into different tabs a bit further onto this video. Okay, so now that we have like an understanding of how we go through each different page, let's actually make something. So first we'll go here and just delete all this. Everything after a return is what's actually going to be rendered by the machine. And for that, we need to be all within a div. So I can just say, welcome to my website. Let's just work with this. And let's delete this. And wow, welcome to my website. Now, as you can see, pretty ugly. Oops. Pretty ugly. There's not much to it. And this is where now we introduce Tailwind. So if we were going back to this, when covering Tailwind CSS, I think a really big understanding is just this. This is what defines Tailwind. It's very small in terms of like the difference it has. All right, so when examining Tailwind, as you can see in this, your work will all be done within class name. And as you can also see in this example, you're able to just do any CSS formatting on the TSX page itself. So now Tailwind carries like a plethora of modifications. Some are specific to text, some are specific to orientation, and just in general, there are so many. But if you really want to just understand the basics, the biggest ones to understand are just the use of flex, justify, and basic text edits, along with color modification. And there's already heavy documentation for this framework, but I find the biggest helper is just this thing on VS Code alone. So let's just open up VS Code real quick. As you can see, I've already created a class name for us for our first welcome page. So if you hold down on Max, Control and Space, you're given a drop down of just plenty of options for you on what you want to use for Tailwind. And let's now aim to, make this website look a little nicer. And I think the biggest thing I want to do is just make this more of an attractive feature to the eyes. So I'm going to try to center it and just make it bigger and bolder. So let's first do that. So for centering, we're going to have to do, first of all, we're going to have to make this a flex, and then we're going to have to justify center. So this will center it for us, but it's a bit too up top. So we can change the padding of this alone, which we can say just for the top, I want it to be a padding of 5 pixels. Now we have that. Now it needs to be bolded. So we can do that using font and bold, which will bold our text. And now we want to make our text bigger, which we can do with text 6 times extra large. And boom, it's all done. And if you want, we can even add color with text blue, and you're given a range of options along with a little like demo of what the color looks like. And I'm just going to say 600 for now. And yeah. So now that we have this, let's move on to actually creating like buttons to route between websites. So when we're talking about routing, we actually want to stick to something called best practice, which is just instead of just using a hyperlink, we want to use something called use router, which is a function in React. It just allows us to render only what's new on a website. So when we work with that, just understand. So this is why we're going to use route instead of just hyperlinking something with using a link from HTML. So the first thing we're going to do is import use router, and then after that, what we want to do is we want to add some component logic here. So the component logic is basically some basics of JavaScript. So we're first going to define a router, which is just going to call our use router that we're importing. And then we want to do something to handle a click, which will make more sense as I write more code. So we're going to first do router.push, which is just what we use to actually switch into the new, tell the code where to actually go to a new page. What the fuck am I saying? God damn. So now let's actually talk about routing. Routing is just switching between different pages on your website. So how do we want to do that? Well, we could do it the easy way, which is just hyperlinking everything using A, just like this. Let's just do A here, hyperreference / about. Now, technically, this will work. Oops, forgot something right here. Hi. Now, this would technically work, and it does take us here, but it is not best practice purely because of the fact that it renders the entire web page instead of just refreshing what's new. And while this doesn't seem like to be a big deal because everything will render out this completely right now, when we have things that stay consistent throughout all the pages like a nav bar, it tends to not be ideal. So instead, what we want to do is use something called use router, which we can do through import use router. And one big mistake is here, this has a switch to navigation. This is just something I don't fully understand why either, but this is the best way to make it work. And what we're going to do is we're going to do some component logic now, which will be written here, where we're first going to call the router, and then we're going to do something here, which is actually create our button. So let's first do that. And right now, if we do it and just say about me, what you can see is there's already an issue here, which is use router takes in client component. And right now we are technically only creating a server-side component. And why is that? That's because up till now, we never had taken user input, but now we do because that's what a use router does. So in order to mitigate this, we have to do something up here called use client. And now this should fix itself. And you can see if I go back to our original page, about me is a button. Doesn't look like much, but trust me, it'll do something. So now that we have this actually created here in our component logic, well, first things first, we need this button to actually be able to handle a click, right? So let's do that. Let's make that happen here, handle click, and let's move that. And let's first do router.push, which is this will help tell the server to actually switch into the new page, which is right here. So let's finish that up, and that's it. All we got to do now is in this button, we got to do on click, which will then we call the handle click functionality. Oops. Seems like a type of their handle click. And what we're going to see here is this will now move us to about. Much better. And now let's actually just make this look a little nicer, shall we? So the best way we can do that is by, again, using class name. And then let's just say we want the, let's first add a border, right? So let's do that. We can say border. Remember, we can always do this. And we'd say border 3. Never mind. Let's first add some padding in the X direction of px4. Then let's add some padding in the Y, but we only want this to be 2. We can add some background to be blue. This way we actually can define where the space is. Boom. And then let's just say we want this, instead of being so harsh, we can make it rounded. And let's just make the text, you can make it white. Look at that. We have a nice little button here. Click on it, and you have this.
So while we have this here, if we go to our about page, we don't have a button going back. So while we can just do this and just copy all of this here, move it here, that isn't ideal. And that kind of gives us a nice segue into components because, well, while that does actually solve a problem, it's not very efficient.
So components are just reusable self-contained pieces of code within the framework like React that just represent like a part of the UI. So in our case, we're trying to recreate a button, but this can be used for multiple things like forms or entire sections with the website, like a navigation bar. The whole point of a component is just help modularize our code and just make it easier to manage and reuse. And it's very useful when you're trying to follow certain design practices that you guys will work on when creating your Figmas. So let's actually move on to creating a component for this button so we can help modularize and make this code just better. So I'm going to VS Code first. And what we're first going to do is just create a components folder. Oops. Components. And within this components folder, we ideally want to keep this outside of the app just for the sake of ease. And we're going to have a new file here, and we're just going to call it navigation button. .tsx. And now we're going to set it up, navigation button. And remember, because we are trying to recreate a button here, we're first going to make a use client. And then we're going to import use router from next navigation. Make sure it's a navigation, not router. And now one more important thing is because this button is going to have to take in two different values. One, what we're actually going to give as text within the button, and two, the actual location of where we're trying to move route. We're going to have to take in two variables, which we're going to take in using navigation button props. So first thing we're going to do is write interface, navigation button props here. And then we're going to have a target URL, which is going to come in as a string, and a label, which is actually going to contain what we want to say. So again, with the string. So now that we have this created, what we can do is within our navigation button, we want to make sure that we know that we're using those two values. So what we do here is we do our curly braces and we say target URL and label will get pushed through the navigation button props. And now that we have this, we can actually work on the component logic. And this kind of follows the same suit as what's here. We're going to first instance a router and then just push using the route. In fact, we can just copy and paste this here, except the only thing is this now can just be our target URL. And now we're going on to our actual button here. Like last time, we can make a button here. And the important thing is because we have a label now, all we got to do is write in curly braces label. And this will just give print out whatever we want typed out earlier. And now we just handle our on click, which like last time, we just reference our handle click. And then we can also give our exact same class names, except for the sake of difference, we can do make it red. And now that we have this, what we can do is if we go to our original page and we said, let's import navigation button, we can first go here, just import it, navigation button. And then again, we're going to reference our target URL we want as select about. Our label can say component to about me. And this alone will do the trick. So let's actually load up our website. As you can see, if I click on this, it moves us here. And there's a little bit of a formatting issue, which I'm gonna fix real quick. I seem to have copied the wrong
class name. Okay, now we go back here. See, we can move in. Now, I want to reinforce this idea that right now in our main page, we have to use client. And use client makes this whole page that's getting rendered follow client side updates. And while this is fine right now because we only have two things that both are using that, it's not the most ideal practice. So now that we have this nav component that specifically references use client, we don't have to reference that whenever we're calling it in separate pages. So instead, what we can do is we can delete use client, take out anything that needed use client on this page, which is just all of this logic. And even if we take this out, you can see that our button will still work. And that's massive when it comes to when you're adding components over components over components within a single page. All right, so we've kind of handled the basics of what you can expect when it comes to Next.js framework. And right now, these are the basics. You can build up from here in many different ways. I recommend a few sources, which I'll like tag at the end. But now let's move on to something that's extremely important, and that's just trying to optimize and speed run this, because right now we made our own custom button and this was fairly simple because it wasn't a very complex goal. But if we have things that are going to be complex in the future, we want to make this a fast process. And to do that, I want to introduce our last subject, which is helpful resources. So the last thing I want to introduce is something called a component library. So component libraries are just pre-existing that are libraries just that use reuse Tailwind CSS and just create pre-styled customizable components. And in our case, we can use things like buttons, cards, modals, and so many more things to simplify the process of creating like consistent and responsive designs. So I am going to teach you guys how to use one specific component library called Daisy UI. So first, we're going to first search it up, daisyui.com. And as you can see, there are a few steps here, and this is usually what you can get an outcome of. If we go here, you can see there's multiple examples of drop downs along with code to create it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install it. So we go here and we copy this. We go to our VS Code and we can enter it. And when we're downloading all this, we may run into issues here and there. You can always fix these with npm audit fix. Okay, so after we get this all fixed, the next step is to just follow through here. And as you can see, it says to import a plugin saying require Daisy UI. And what we can do is we just find tailwind.config.js right here. And we just add it as a plugins to our existing exports. So what we can do is we can first just see it says plugins right here. We can just say require Daisy UI like this, and this solves your problem. Okay, cool. And once we have all that done, what we can do is let's first actually just make a nav bar. So let's go to our navigation, say nav bar, and I'm just going to pick the first one here. We can take our JSX, copy it. We'll create a component for now called navbar.csx. Make our nav bar here and paste this. Unreachable code detected. Oh, all right. All right. So now that we've created our nav bar, let's actually move on to creating it in layout. Because like I said, layout will have
we'll have whatever components we need that we want throughout every single page. So first things first, this is what we're given. We can delete a few things from this. Now within body, we can have children, yes, of course, but we can also just delete all of this. Close this up. We don't really need any of this. Yep, no real changes. So now let's import navbar, and we can just paste that into our body like this. And as you can see, now we have this right here. This navbar will now be transparent throughout all parts of the website, and it just makes great use of the layout and also components. Now, see, this became simple as is, and what we can do is we can try to make it so much more complex without having to do any effort because of the pre-existing libraries that Daisy, like Daisy UI. And there are plenty more, and it's really up to you, but I recommend Daisy UI because it's just really simple to understand. But yeah. So we've now covered all 6 topics of this video. Hopefully by this point you understand how to start your project and at least get some basic routing done to handle multiple pages. Obviously, you're going to have to learn a bit more about component um, logic, and things like that will just take a little bit of time, but between yourselves, the internet, and the presence of ChatGPT, you should be able to get an understanding of what their next steps are, and these will just help give you as the basics for front end if you ever choose to use Next.js app router. Thank you so much. I will link a few resources somewhere because there are great videos and resources out there that I myself used to learn these technologies and will do much better job of explaining it, but it will just be a little bit more in depth. Um, yeah.